So even when you think about like blasphemy laws, for instance, you know, like if somebody blasphemed Jesus Christ, you're in trouble. If somebody blasphemed, you know, Muhammad 100 years ago, you're not in trouble. Why? Well, it's not equal weights and measures.
The Second Amendment was never understood to mean that you can't put any restrictions on the ability of people to keep and bear arms.
Nobody actually wants the Constitution. They just use it when it's convenient for their ends.
That's correct.
True. No, hang on. Sorry, Tim. I have to. It's not fascism. Inequality is not fascism. Fascism is the sublimation of everybody to the state. It is a coherent philosophy. It's a stupid philosophy.
No, wait, hold on, wait. I agree with you.
If anything, we're fighting the same separation of powers issues that we're doing today as they were back in the day.
We agree on that.
So rebellion is a type of prolonged insurrection, okay? Insurrection is the broader term here, and rebellion is a subset of it. And insurrection is levying war against the United States. It's
the exact same thing. Okay. I'm calling them the same thing. I'm saying law enforcement should have done the same thing, and you're choosing one to be and one not to be.
No. Current problem that America has is they're in a state of emergency. They've imported, what, 10 to 15 million illegals in the last 4 to 5 years alone?
No, I mean, I don't know that you're representing it fairly, but...
I just showed you.
Okay, just because they tear down a neighborhood doesn't mean it was done in violation of, like, the rights of these people, or it was done... hang on. But you agree with...
Illegal destruction of the black community is okay. Is that what you said?
So, under the laws of the United States, there are certain federalizations under Title 10 which would be illegal.
So we have a solution to the problem of crime. They bulldozed all the black people's homes and kicked them out and forced them into poverty and worse circumstances.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. And this is not a Piers Morgan Uncensored. As a matter of fact, it is the Culture War with Tim Pool. And this is a very, very good debate. These are much better, in my opinion, than Piers Morgan Uncensored, because Piers Morgan Uncensored, generally speaking, is just people yelling back and forth. I mean, they do get into some debates, but for the most part, it's just yelling back and forth. This is an actual debate. It's not a sanctioned debate or anything like that, but it's a pretty good debate. We got Pisco coming in. We got a couple other side characters coming in. They're going to make all the arguments. We're going to get into this debate. We're going to talk about freedom of speech, the Second Amendment, Donald Trump deploying the National Guard, January 6th. There's all kinds of topics, and we are going to suss all these things out and let us figure out which side we are going to fall upon, folks. They're going to make the arguments, and you are going to decide where you're going to fall. So y'all don't forget to do me that favor. Smash that like button for me. Subscribe if you're new around here. Share this video anywhere and everywhere you can. Click that join button. Sign up and become a member. That would be the best way to help this channel expand and grow. And without any further ado, folks, let's get it.
A place called the LeClaire Courts. It was basically all black houses and neighborhoods, and because of the violence, specifically and literally from this black neighborhood, coming into other areas, shootings. There's the gang initiations called getting V'd. We had routinely in my neighborhood, which was largely white working class immigrant and Latino, the people from the LeClaire Courts, largely, it was almost entirely black, would come over and just rob you blind, and the cops couldn't do anything about it. And the cops said, the problem is we get sued instantly on racial grounds because we end up arresting a bunch of black people. So the city liberals, the Democrats, said, we have a solution to the problem of crime. They bulldozed all the black people's homes and kicked them out and forced them into poverty and worse circumstances. That was the Democrat strategy. I don't agree with that. I think it's a bad strategy. Donald Trump says, we'll deploy the National Guard. They will not enforce laws. They'll likely just be cleaning up trash. But the strategy here is gangbangers are going to be scared to open fire on crowds when there's a bunch of National Guard standing around. As a Chicago native and resident, I believe it is preferable to take the Donald Trump conservative approach of deploy National Guard, but not to enforce laws, but as a presence, as opposed to the Democrat strategy of tear down the homes of black people and kick them out and make them homeless. What do you think?
Even if it's illegal?
Deploying the National Guard?
Would you support the deployment of the National Guard in a city if it was illegal?
So we're talking about a specific incident in Chicago right now, the real world, not a hypothetical, is it on paper or not? We're dealing with two scenarios. First, I will stress, Trump can legally deploy the National Guard. They just can't enforce the law.
In every circumstance, you think he has unbridled authority to deploy the National Guard whenever he wants? Any National Guard?
So in Chicago, we're talking about an emergency scenario that Trump could declare an emergency.
Well, then you can just answer the question. You can, like, if someone says, for example, in every circumstance, can he deploy the National Guard? You can just say no in some circumstances, right?
Now let's talk about the real world.
Well, you didn't answer that, right? Not in every circumstance.
There's no absolutes.
Right. So you agree with me, don't you, that there are congressionally imposed limits on the president's use of the National Guard that are found in Article 1 of the Constitution
I would
that
say
Congress...
There are certain circumstances where it would be argued that Trump's deployment of the National Guard is illegal. That is a good thing and he should do it.
It would be argued. I'm just asking an abstract, right? Under the laws of the United States, there are certain federalizations under Title 10 which would be illegal.
So let me answer your question. In some circumstances, it is a good thing that Trump would deploy the National Guard illegally.
Okay. I mean...
And so let's talk about the real world.
Okay.
The real world is Democrats literally... let me pull this up for you. I'll show you my neighborhood. The Democrats bulldozed black people's homes and wiped out their community. Is that what you want to happen?
No.
Well, that's what happened.
But why is... Okay, so they do something bad, so we should deploy illegal deployment?
It's called... Well, what's preferable? The Democrat strategy to bulldoze their homes and make them homeless, or Trump having 84 National Guards standing periodically on street corners?
I'll tell you why I would prefer, it's a false dichotomy, but if you were going to force me to choose between bulldozing homes and illegal deployments, at a bare minimum, right, bulldozing homes would be some act that I assume was passed off democratically. But do you agree with that or not?
I just love the idea that it's like, hey, we got a problem with crime in the black community, so the Democrats of Chicago destroyed all their houses.
No, but I'm telling you it's a false dichotomy, but like...
That's what they did.
You understand that, like, I don't know that you're representing that would happen. I'm taking your representation
I'll show you
on good faith, but
Google
assume
Earth.
that. Like, why does that affect whether or not we should support an illegal deployment of the National Guard?
It sounds like you're putting a lot of emphasis on the legality. So to use the dichotomy that Tim presented, the idea of black people's homes being bulldozed, you mentioned, well, at least that would come about, we would presume, democratically. Does that make it just to you?
Just because something is brought about democratically doesn't mean that it's just, but there are longer-term interests in the survival of the country that are at stake when you just, don't think about the constitutional framework and history of our country, which was particularly worried with standing armies. As libertarians, you guys must be concerned. I assume that you believe in rights, right?
Yes, I believe that there are natural rights. What are some examples? I'm just curious.
I wonder.
I'm not familiar with you, but what's an example of nationalizing, federalizing the National Guard in order to go into some situation?
So just real quick, this is 48th West 44th Street. This is a couple blocks from where I grew up. And it's all just beautiful, lush fields surrounded by fences. That's what it is. I wonder if I can go back in time. Oh, yeah, look at this. That's where black people used to live. Look at all these houses. They fucking destroyed because instead of saying we want to deal with the crime, they went in, evicted all of the black people and ripped their homes down.
I'm not sure about the particulars of this, Tim, but like we're not here to discuss.
Sure.
Was this
my neighborhood.
smart or not? I mean, if this happened in your neighborhood, I'm really sorry about that. But we're not here to discuss this, right? Are we here to discuss the bulldozing of homes? Or are we here to discuss
2011,
the National Guard?
We're here to discuss what is the solution to the problem of crime, and is it? You can make the argument that there's a pie in the. Actually, let me put it this way. I from this neighborhood, growing up in Chicago. Who have lost friends to the gang violence and the crime and the drug trade, who have friends who've witnessed corpses being dragged down alleys, who was personally shot at. The hot dog stand, the little shop that was 2 blocks from where I grew up, had bullet holes in its bulletproof windows. And I don't want to pretend like that's the apocalypse, because I know that life was bad when we all lived in the woods and were fighting each other in war in Europe or Asia or whatever it may have been. I get it. Science technology has improved, but children shouldn't grow up in places like this. Crime shouldn't be this way. Now, my whole life, I've been told by Democrats, the solution is not to arrest these people and to let them go. And when the crime got so bad and the people were so pissed off that it wasn't tenable anymore, what did they do? They literally just destroyed the black neighborhood. The city decided to go in and bulldoze everything and rip it out of the ground and evict all of these people. I don't think that's a solution either. All that's going to do is shuffle it under the rug and make more crime. So that strategy didn't work. I'm not saying these are the only plays. Donald Trump's play is the estimates are about 80 National Guard per city. And what they'll likely be doing is picking up trash. They do not have the authority to enforce the law, local law. But the idea is in these areas where gangs come into, like Vidham Park, where I grew up, where you'd see 15 black teenagers come into our neighborhood and just steal everything from you. They won't do it when there are 2 National Guardsmen standing there with rifles.
Will you condemn the National Guard if they help execute a search warrant for ICE?
Why?
Because you said that you wouldn't be in favor of them enforcing civilian law.
I didn't say that.
Would you be in favor of the National Guard enforcing immigration law?
Should there be a declared emergency under color of law and it's legal and allowed?
Well, one of the ways in which you're trying to sell this is you're saying they're just going to be standing there as a presence, a show of force.
That's the argument.
I think that is by itself also problematic under our history and framework of our Constitution, where we're specifically scared of standing armies, and the founders especially, right? They have every 2 years, right? The army lapses. There's a requirement in the Constitution.
You're not arguing what I'm talking about.
What I'm trying to say is there's a big concern to have military domestic presence of the military.
No, there
isn't. You said one of the way that you were there isn't in our history.
No. Don't. Where are you from? Are you from Chicago?
I'm from New York.
Oh, you're from New York. Yeah. I find it very difficult, having experienced the things that I did, to have people not from this place tell me that I don't want National Guard in my home.
I didn't say that. I said our history.
Yeah, okay, I get that. I am begging Donald Trump to send in the National Guard to put an end to this shit.
But part of the way that you're selling it is, don't worry, they're not going to enforce civilian law. That's part of what you're selling.
I said the plan was this. And I also said in some circumstances, an illegal deployment of the National Guard would be good. Oh. What's your solution to this? What's your solution?
I don't know. We're not here to discuss my broader solution to crime.
You don't have one.
Wait, we're not here to discuss my broader solution to crime, are we? Are we here to discuss crime generally, or the deployment of the National Guard and the military? Whether that's something we support.
The underlying issue of the deployment of the National Guard is the crime.
It's because of murder. It's because of the crime.
Okay, because of murder, we think that we should deploy the military. So would you be in favor of...
I think you need to do whatever it takes to make murder stop.
Even doing illegal stuff, right?
Yeah, because
what is illegal?
Is that right?
He who saves his country violates no law.
So this is the fascinating thing. Legal and illegal.
You say fascism. You say, is this fascism? And what I'm hearing right now is, it doesn't matter if it's legal or illegal. We're going to support.
Right. So you support the legal destruction of the black neighborhoods?
No, I mean, I don't know that you're representing it fairly, but
I just showed you.
Okay, just because they tear down a neighborhood doesn't mean it was done in violation of like the rights of these people, or it was done. Hang on. Wait, you agree with
legal destruction of the black community is okay? Is that what you said?
So, just to be clear, you would agree that just because a neighborhood was bulldozed does not mean that was a wrong thing to do, right?
Say that one more time.
You're representing me for the first time the fact that this neighborhood was bulldozed. I can't comment on it other than to say, if you're representing it correctly, that it was all done unfairly,
well, I'll put it like
bad
this.
motive, then sure, it was a wrong thing to do. But that doesn't bear on whether or not the National Guard deployment is okay.
Do you think that Donald Trump's argument for the deployment of the National Guard is legitimate, or is he making excuses?
It's illegitimate, obviously.
So in Chicago, there's not going to be a single Democratic politician who's going to come out and tell you, because crime got so bad, we flattened the black community. They're not going to say that.
Yeah, but why are we playing this game of whataboutism when we're like, okay, the Democrats had a bad policy on crime. By the way, they've had multiple bad policies on crime over the course of decades and decades and decades.
It's not whataboutism. It's quite simple. It's for decades, for generations. The Democrat policies, the liberal plans, the plans you're presenting, and the counter that you're making to Donald Trump has failed and has resulted in people that I know being dead. And the response from the city was, of course, they're going to give platitudes. We're going to beautify the area. And they don't say, hey, the gang violence, murder has gotten so bad and the drug dealing so
why not have the military enforce the civilian law?
He who saves this country violates no laws. I love that. You know, a lot of people, they view Abraham Lincoln as one of the greatest presidents in United States history. He, as a matter of fact, suspended habeas corpus in a corridor down to Maryland, arrested a lot of the Maryland legislature, right, because they were Confederate sympathizers. Maryland was a slave state, right? So Abraham Lincoln violated a lot of laws and violated the Constitution in many cases, and we still view the man as one of the greatest presidents in American history because he saved this country. He won the war. He brought back the rebels, the rebellion, the Confederate states, the Democrats, if you will, if you want to go with a modern representation of that. It's kind of what that was. But, you know, it brings it back to the question. Okay, so what Donald Trump is doing, he's sending in the National Guard to these places where the local governments, they just refuse to enforce the laws that are on the books. You know, these cops can go out and they can arrest the criminals, but if the DA just lets these people go or drops their charges down to misdemeanors or whatever it may be, and they don't actually enforce the laws that are on the books, what good are these DAs? What good was the job of the cop? You know, it disincentivizes police officers to actually get out there and go do their job. So the fact that they're calling it illegal, which it remains to be seen whether it's illegal or not. And just because a judge slams a gavel down, you know, in a federal circuit somewhere and says, well, he can't do this, doesn't mean that it's illegal. Doesn't mean that it's just. doesn't mean that it's the wrong thing to do. Doesn't mean that it's right either, right? We got to look at in context what the National Guard is actually doing. Now, the argument has been made, well, why is Donald Trump just sending the National Guard to blue states and blue cities? Well, that's where the vast majority of the crime is. Once again, folks, I put out this stat all the time. 19 out of the 20 highest crime cities in this country are ran by Democrats. And, Democrats try to combat this by saying basically that, red states have higher crime, blah, blah, blah. They always have to invoke the state. Well, it's not the state. It's the city that is ran by Democrats. They have to ignore that, folks, because they can't get out from underneath the fact that Democrat policy, as far as policing, has failed. You can't coddle these criminals. We must enforce the laws. A lot of people, they like to try to say, well, you send somebody to prison, they're supposed to be reformed or whatever. Well, that's not what prison is for. That was never the intention of prison. Prison was always meant as a punishment. You go and you serve your time, and you get out and you try to reform yourself at that point. Prison isn't reformation, for crying out loud, because if you put a bunch of criminals in a box, what do you think is going to happen, right? That's why I believe that the general population, which is supposed to be humane because, humans need interaction, is one of the worst conditions that you could be put in when you get put in to prison, because once again, you're just grouping yourself around a bunch of other criminals, and they can swap stories or whatever, and figure out how to evade law enforcement, and it just makes them more criminal, right? A lot of times you have these gangsters get put into prison, they form gangs in prison, and a lot of times, a lot of people, they go in there as a lone wolf or whatever, just to survive, they'll join up with the gang. And then it's too late at that point. You already joined the gang. You can't really leave the gang once you join up with the gang. But getting back to the point at hand, what Donald Trump is doing with the National Guard, I think it's a good idea, because if they're refusing to enforce the laws, somebody must come in and sow some law and order over the situation, right? We must have law and order in this country. And if they are refusing to do that, folks, something has to change in this country, and we can't allow criminals just to run amok in this country. I think, Tim is right on this. Kids should not grow up in a situation where they have to watch their backs, or they can't go out and play in the streets, or go down the street and go to the grocery store or something, because they're too worried about a shootout or them getting kidnapped or anything like that. We have the resources that we could have enough police officers out there to where we minimize crime to the maximum amount possible. But you've got to enforce those laws. There has to be severe enough punishment that the criminal thinks twice before committing a crime. And if it's something like where they're going to steal a loaf of bread to feed their family, right? That's where churches should come in, right? We have food banks out there. There really isn't that much of an excuse for people to get out there and go steal food, for goodness sakes. And all this other crime, like going to rob places, folks, it's ridiculous, and it's completely unnecessary. These people, they're not robbing you because they're broke. They're robbing you because of pride, because somebody dared them to do so. And once they dared them to do so, they must do it. I don't understand the crime ethos in this country. I don't understand the crime culture in this country. I don't understand a lot of that. Like, I was kind of a part of that, but for me, it was just, I did something stupid, like got into a car and I shouldn't have been driving. We'll put it that way. Things like that. I never was a career criminal, if you will. I've been arrested a few times, and I spent 3 weeks in jail while I was waiting to go to court. And, that was enough for me to where I'm like, I'm not going to do none of this anymore. That's it. I couldn't stand being in jail, so I quit committing crimes essentially back then. So I'm not going to do none of that stuff anymore. But we need to convey that to other people, that there are other pathways other than being a career criminal, essentially. I don't understand that mindset whatsoever, but let's keep going.
Kind of emergency. So
like which one?
So for example, the title he invoked in California, it's rebellion. It's invasion, none of which are present, and an inability to enforce law.
How to define invasion?
Well, okay, why should I have to define invasion right now as we speak?
Because you said Trump cited invasion.
He did not cite invasion. He cited the statute which calls invasion. So he's not pretending there's invasion. He does pretend there's invasion for purposes of the Alien Enemies Act, which has been rejected now even by the Fifth Circuit.
Let's start over. We'll slow down. What was the basis by which Trump justified the deployment of the National Guard?
He said that there was a rebellion. Do you agree with that in LA?
Yeah.
Okay, so
it's semantic.
So you agree that you agree that there was a rebellion in LA. I just want to hear you say January 6th was a rebellion.
In what way?
You just said so certainly you mean something when you said you agreed that what happened in LA with ICE was a rebellion. You have your own standard for what you meant by rebellion. So clearly that applies to January 6th, doesn't it?
In January 6th, was there a foreign government saying that their people were agitating on behalf of?
I don't know what you're talking about. That the Scheinbahn represent that like the Mexican residents were doing. They were waving
flag.
They were waving foreign flags on January 6th. They were waving Georgian flag, the country of Georgia flag. They were waving.
Was the head of Georgia agitating for Georgian national citizens or ethnically Georgian?
That turns on whether something is a rebellion.
Or invasion.
So whether or not they're waving a flag and whether a foreign country
is saying that these are our shock troops to leverage political.
That changes in your mind whether something is a rebellion or not.
Or an invasion, yes. Of course it does.
The important thing to consider is the legal definition versus the colloquial or the semantic as interpreted by different individuals. The thing about January 6th is that I would argue certainly some of those people thought they were engaged in insurrection or rebellion. That's
not whether they thought, whether you called it and are willing to call it a rebellion. But you are willing to call LA, what happened in LA, the violence that occurred in LA, a rebellion. Why is that?
So with January 6th, it was disorganized and random. Some of you make this look on your face, but you interrupted me before I can make my point.
Yeah, sure.
Some of the people who shut up certainly did have the intent to disrupt the electoral vote count. I think I have no problem with these people being criminally charged, locked up, and I think you go to prison for this, especially fighting cops. Was there an organized effort to bring people to January 6th for that purpose? It does not appear to be the case. That's why they didn't actually charge anybody under insurrection or anything like that.
They charge people of seditious conspiracy, which is a design to
indeed and
bring people there to
incorrect.
What do you
was specifically among Oath Keepers and Proud Boys, specifically among those.
So they were engaged in rebellion, weren't they?
Group of individuals.
Were they engaged in rebellion?
That's actually an argument to be made. I would argue no.
Why not? Why were they not engaged in rebellion?
Let's roll, baby.
Did you
see
read
with the ICE riots, where you have the federal law, you have federal government going in specifically to enforce a law, an organized group of people putting out flyers and saying, for the purpose of this, we will come out and engage in violence, is different, right? Not everybody in LA engaged in this is the point I'm making. People at January 6th.
Not everyone at January 6th did either. Not everyone in LA did either.
Exactly my point.
Yeah.
So when they went and arrested J6ers, and I said they should have been, what's the problem?
We're not talking about arrest. We're talking about whether or not something is categorized as a rebellion. You were quite willing,
and they did not
to call what happened in LA a rebellion
for the purpose of deploying law enforcement to put a stop to it. As I would agree with January 6th. Yes, we're in agreement.
Oh, so January 6th was a rebellion?
No.
Okay.
This is
help me out here.
So you're playing a semantic game instead of actually arguing.
I think you're playing the game here. I think
the game is actually quite simple. In both circumstances, law was invoked to deploy law enforcement to stop a riot. I agree with both circumstances in LA and DC to stop the riot.
LA was more organized, and that changes whether it's a rebellion or not.
Among the people who organized it for the intention, be it LA or January 6th, they were engaged.
Even though they were organized in Jan, I mean, come on, you know that they were organized in Jan 6th. I mean, not just because not everyone is part of the plan. They were people who were organized with a specific seditious
So if my
purpose.
argument is that there were some people on Jan 6th that intended to overthrow, to stop the vote count, most didn't, and there were some people in LA that were intending to stop federal government from engaging in law enforcement, which is, under the law, the same thing, insurrection or rebellion.
So in terms of frustrating the federal purpose,
so they're the exact same thing. Okay. I'm calling them the same thing. I'm saying law enforcement should have done the same thing, and you're choosing one to be and one not to be.
No, hang on. You're saying that what happened in LA was a rebellion, and what happened at Jan 6 wasn't. You're saying that there's a distinction there.
I'm saying that there was an organized effort among leftist activists across California. We did not see that as a coordinated effort with January 6th. However, some people on January 6th did have that intent, and if the government were to say, we are going to invoke the same act for the deployment of law enforcement to stop these violent actions, that is acceptable. We agree on that.
So rebellion is a type of prolonged insurrection. Okay, insurrection is the broader term here, and rebellion is a subset of it. And insurrection is levying war against the United States. It's a type of treason, all right? And levying war, and it has 4 elements to it: an assemblage, a public purpose, the use of force or intimidation, and to frustrate a U.S. law and basically to violate a U.S. law. And so I would, because I'm consistent, I would say that there are some things.
You're not.
And I am consistent in LA that would, under the historical definition of insurrection, qualify as an insurrection.
So let's
hang on a second. I am consistent though, because I use that historical definition. I don't know what definition you guys are using, which is like somehow a foreign country has some role into whether something is an insurrection. Like, where are you getting that definition from?
Invasion. You cited invasion. He pointed out invasion.
But Trump did not cite an invasion for his invocation of the National Guard.
You said he did.
So we should no. I said he cited a statute which includes one of the purposes in it: invasion, rebellion, or inability to.
So invasion is included. So let's make something clear.
He did not make a finding that
on January 6th, a large portion of the people who were arrested and charged did not engage in insurrection, did not engage in rebellion, did not riot, did not fight with police, did not tear down barricades, did not smash windows. There were people who showed up an hour after police had cleared everybody out. The doors were still open. The paths were still clear. I've interviewed some of these people. I have met them. One couple, they were in their late 50s, showed up an hour after everything had stopped, walked up the stairs to open doors, walked in, looking around, shrugged and left, and got convicted and sentenced to 18 months in jail. This is the distinction.
What is that? That's a distinction in terms of whether something is an insurrection or rebellion?
When we're talking about the whole of January 6th, we can't put a blanket on every single person who was arrested and charged.
That's what I'm trying to do.
So I want to make sure that's clear then. So you're not
I'm not trying to say that everyone who didn't engage in insurrection.
I will put it this. Yeah. I will put it very simply. There were people who intended to stop the vote count. Many of these people were violent. They should go to jail. They should be convicted.
Did they engage in insurrection?
It's tough to say because we're talking about two different things. The legal, which is infringing, like
under what you understand the legal standard to be.
There's a difference between the constitutional, what insurrection is, and when the president can invoke the Insurrection Act. That's the debate we had several months ago, which regular people don't understand the distinction. The Insurrection Act refers to trying to overthrow the governments, right? I'm sorry, the 14th Amendment statement about insurrection. This is what the Supreme Court ruled. However, the Insurrection Act is just when someone is
Black Lives Matter wasn't an insurrection under the constitutional test, even though you called it an insurrection.
That was under the Insurrection Act, which is the point I'm making right now. Okay. The Insurrection Act is when local law is not being enforced or individuals are stopping the federal government from enforcing law.
So why hasn't Trump invoked the Insurrection Act?
Yeah, I should. Fuck yeah,
okay, but he hasn't. And until he does, don't you think that you need to analyze? Like, you're basically saying that you don't care to analyze whether Trump's actions are legal or not under the current authorities
that is a huge leap that is not part of the
do you care to analyze whether his actions are legal, or if they're illegal, are you going to say who cares if it's illegal? That's what I'm kind of getting at. Is like, should I even bother?
We've already analyzed that they're legal, and they are. And
we haven't analyzed, but I'm saying that they're illegal.
Bro, Abby Phillips, all the liberals were like, yeah, Trump can do this.
Just because Abby Phillips says it doesn't mean that she's right. Come on, man. You're going to trust CNN?
Making the point that the liberal narrative, except for you, is that while Trump can deploy National Guard, so long as they're picking up trash and not enforcing law.
It's not true. Gavin Newsom is in court right now. They just had a ruling that what he did in California violated posse comitatus.
He won. The latest appeal was that the restrictions are lifted.
Hang on. No.
It's gone back and forth like 3 or 4 times.
The latest was that there was a trial on posse comitatus, and Judge Breyer found that they did, in fact, violate posse comitatus.
The latest was that the restrictions were lifted and Trump
Breyer himself stayed his own order to let the Ninth Circuit percolate. They're already reviewing it, whatever. All that is to say is it's a live issue under the courts, and it's a separate issue whether or not the courts are able to review it and whether or not he's following the law.
Can I just what
he said, because he had something very interesting. He was basically saying this is a wholly different context, and so me trying to apply posse comitatus, a law that's on the books, to the conduct now, it's removing and divorcing the context of 1878 and applying it and misapplying it in the current day. That's not true. We're fighting the same battles that we're doing now, like that they were,
personally, I can't stand this appeal to the courts nonsense that just because, this federal judge said Donald Trump can't do this, well, it's illegal and he's a fascist because he's doing it anyway. They said he can't do it. He knew it was illegal, therefore he's a fascist. No, I'm sorry. That's just garbage. We know that there's a lot of activists in robes, and these activists are absolutely misappropriating statutes under the Constitution to try to say that what Donald Trump is doing is wrong. That's garbage. These statutes, like the Constitution, is constantly misappropriated, in my opinion. They don't think about the historical context of what was going on. Why did they create this legislation in the first place? Why did they insert this into the Constitution? But see, they misappropriate that. Just because the language says something, oh, we can take that language and apply it to this in a totally different context and say, well, that's unconstitutional. I'm sorry, that's garbage, right? We're going to get into this here in a little bit, but, you know, everybody will misappropriate the Constitution to suit their own means whenever they feel so, like whenever they want to, whenever they can invoke whatever they can from the Constitution. When they find it a benefit to their political cause, they will invoke the Constitution and bludgeon you over the head with it just because they can, just because it's politically advantageous for them to do so. And I think that's garbage. What we need to look at the situation on the ground, right? What was going on in LA as to what they're talking about. Now, you know, comparing January 6th to what was going on in LA, that's like apples to freaking grapefruits or something like that. It's like not even oranges, right? It's more like apples to chili peppers. It's just completely a different situation. The context is totally different. What happened was totally different. There is no comparison there. Sure, you might be able to call both a rebellion if you want to, but, you know, one, you have these people over here. It's a concentrated, sustained effort by those people. In a lot of cases, foreign nationals waving foreign flags, obstructing federal law enforcement from doing their job. Yeah, I would say that's an insurrection. They were fighting with cops. As a matter of fact, that is an insurrection. So was January 6th, but that's a totally different form of insurrection, right? They were just fighting with cops. They didn't actually obstruct the vote count, right? Sure, there may have been intent from some people to do so, but the overarching narrative there was basically a lot of those people thought that election was stolen, and there was some evidence at the time we didn't know, but hey, there was enough evidence that, yeah, okay, I can see why they're doing this. Now, I'm not trying to justify fighting with cops. That's never good. They should have never got violent. Donald Trump told them not to be violent, and it is what it is. As a matter of fact, the BBC CEO and like their chief of news or something like that, they just resigned because BBC a little while back put out a documentary about Donald Trump, about January 6th, and they selectively edited his speech and put two things together from one end of the speech and the other end of the speech, which was like an hour and some change long, right? So they selectively edited it to portray a narrative. But getting back to this, you know, what was going on in LA, something totally different, right? You actually had former nationals fighting with cops. Here, it's American citizens fighting with cops for a totally different reason. It was Capitol Police. It wasn't a sustained effort, not like what was going on in LA. So I don't understand why they're comparing the two here. You want to call it both a rebellion? Sure, I get it. You know, Tim Pool might not call it a rebellion just for the sake of the debate, but it kind of was. You know, if we're being fair about this, the difference here, though, is what happened after the fact, right? The FBI was weaponized against the American people to go after innocent and peaceful protesters, people that did not fight with cops, they did not enter the Capitol, none of those things. And they went after these people, and they overcharged, in many cases, a lot of these people. These sentences were overly egregiously long. Like, it was just completely insane what happened with January 6th. But I still think what Donald Trump was doing was the right move. And just because Gavin Newsom doesn't want them there doesn't mean that it's the right thing to do. Let's keep going.
Ticking time bomb, and it wouldn't justify it. So you could say that about any group, right?
Well, maybe.
But hang on a second. You understand this logic. You acknowledge that there have been Christian nationalist shooters, right?
I mean,
It's questionable?
I'd have to look at the person
At
and
least
determine
one?
whether or not they're a Christian nationalist.
Do you think that there hasn't been at least one Christian nationalist shooter?
Again, I'd have to look at that guy and see his views to tell
Okay.
you what I'm a Christian nationalist.
Okay.
There are plenty of people who call themselves Christian nationalists.
do violence,
They are not
right?
Christian nationalist.
Okay.
They are not.
They at least self-report as Christian nationalists.
There are always
So
retorted
some
people, yes.
self-identifying Christian nationalists went out and committed a shooting.
Here's the difference.
Would you be like, okay, well they're ticking time bombs of violence, so we
No,
should take away their gun
absolutely
rights?
not.
Are they on
Because
drugs?
there's a
Not, yeah.
difference in
But what
somebody
drugs are
having
they
a
on?
certain view versus somebody literally being chemically engineered to be crazy. These hormones actually, we're talking about a biological shift that makes someone unstable.
I have a question for Pisco.
Yeah.
Because you said no, right? Like trans people should be allowed to have guns.
Yes. Do you agree?
Do you believe that? I think the answer is yes. Yeah. I think they should be allowed to have guns. I don't think the Second Amendment says that you have the right to keep and bear arms unless you're found deficient by the state. But do you think under the DSM-5 certain mental disorders would disqualify you from owning guns?
Correct. Yeah. But transgenderism is not a mental disorder.
So this is important. What
It
you're
is.
basically saying
It
is
should
that
be.
you have a personal opinion.
It should be.
Hold on. What you're saying is, here's a list of mental disorders. You have an opinion that some should or should not be disqualifying.
Yeah.
I think none of them should be disqualifying.
Okay, so schizophrenic should be allowed to own guns?
Yes.
No.
The Second Amendment says the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. You got a problem with it, amend it.
Okay. I mean,
Then amend it.
I think that Scalia,
Agreed.
Scalia and Heller said that there are certain categories, just because it's the
Wrong.
same thing with free speech. He's wrong.
Indeed. And so is Kavanaugh. And so this is where we get to an interesting argument where you, I believe, are putting subjective morals onto the Constitution, which you accused us of doing. My argument is this. The Founding Fathers were pretty dang clear when they were drafting the Constitution, the reasons for why they were doing it, and what the Second Amendment says. We as a society cannot exist with a written Constitution where we arbitrarily decide without amending it that we've changed it.
Yeah. Okay. I agree with that. And I don't think that I'm amending it by incorporating some standards that were then existing. That's what the Bruin case recently, which was much more protective of Second Amendment rights than before. I mean, we have a big protection of Second Amendment in recent cases.
Kids had guns
But
back then.
why do you value the Second Amendment more than like the militia clauses for purposes of like the standing army situation? You know, the Second Amendment, if anything, is reifying, is promoting the militia, right? The state-run militias.
Wrong.
A well-regulated militia being necessary. No,
What does regulated mean?
I understand. Yeah.
What does regulated mean?
Yeah, so I understand that like the Second Amendment also incorporates an individual right. I'm not just
What does
saying
regulated
I'm
mean?
not saying so. Regulation means government restriction.
It does not.
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
Who are the regulars?
And also,
who are the regulars?
Yeah. So in training as well. And so government.
Okay.
The
Hold
government
on.
ability
Slow down.
to train.
I don't want to gloss over this.
Yeah.
Who were the regulars?
The states were in charge of running their militias.
Who were the regulars?
Oh, sorry. The regulars.
Is it proper noun?
Yeah. So a regular militia people were of the community. I don't know what you mean by regulars in that context.
Okay, so the soldiers of the British Army were called regulars.
Yeah.
Regulation back then, in this context, referred to functioning, not government sanctioned.
So the Second Amendment anticipates the use of the militia, which are people like not regulars in that sense,
Exactly.
but are part of the community, are members of that's what the militia was.
Regulated in this context means their guns should be functioning and equipped.
Again, I'm not having a Second Amendment debate with you on the merits. I'm just telling you that the Second Amendment does, as understood by the Supreme Court, anticipate some individual rights. So I'm not contesting that.
The point I'm
what
bringing
saying
up
is,
with
why
this-
do you value that right over the other restrictions in the Constitution,
ones?
giving to Congress the ability to regulate the militia and to set forth for calling forth the militia that Trump is violating? So you seem to respect one part of the Constitution,
The right
Second
of the
Amendment,
people
more than
to keep and
Congress's
bear arms
powers.
shall not be infringed.
Yeah, why do you keep repeating that?
Because that's what it says.
Okay.
So
I'm asking you a
or the
question.
people-
Why do you respect the Second Amendment?
Because one
more
is good
than
I respect
and the
all
other
of it.
one is being used for bad.
No, wait.
you just said that you
That's why.
shouldn't do that. You shouldn't interpose your subjective opinion before the framers' design. That's what you said.
So can we, without vote, change the Constitution?
No, you shouldn't be able to. No.
So when it says the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, can we infringe upon the right to keep and bear arms without vote?
No.
Okay. I don't
You
understand.
need to amend the Constitution. In the meantime, though, what you can do is you can say that for the same reason that, people who are schizophrenic can't own guns, you could actually say this is a condition that bans somebody.
I'm approaching this just from a logical platform, and this is why I think conservatives, liberals, libertarians, everybody, maybe not the anarcho-capitalists, are lying to themselves.
Why do you?
Nobody actually wants the Constitution. They just use it when it's convenient for their ends.
That's correct.
No,
That's
hang on.
correct.
That's not true.
Yeah.
So
Yes, it is.
That is not true. The Second Amendment was never
We
understood.
had blasphemy laws in this country for hundreds of years.
Bring them back. Bring them
Second
back.
Amendment-
Blue laws, Sabbath laws. Let's go. Talk about the First Amendment. I'm ready for that one.
That's the point. My point.
The Second Amendment was never understood to mean that you can't put any restrictions on the ability of people to keep and bear arms. For example, ex-felons. It was always understood that the right to keep and bear arms does not extend to ex-felons.
Yes, and also, did you know that in the 1800s, it was commonplace for local sheriffs and big cities to confiscate the weapons of individuals entering those towns? The Constitution, as people believe it to exist, never existed. Never did.
Right. It's all
Maybe the Third Amendment.
So even when you think about like blasphemy laws, for instance, you know, like if somebody blasphemed Jesus Christ, you're in trouble. If somebody blasphemed, Muhammad 100 years ago, you're not in trouble. Why? Well, it's not equal weights and measures. No, it doesn't need to be equal weights and measures.
Now it's the other way around.
One God is true. That's correct. One God is true, and the other one is false. And it's the political will of the people who ultimately are determining that. So it's not. We have all these laws, and we have the Constitution to bind us and to restrain us from doing good.
Do you respect the Constitution?
I respect the Constitution insofar as it aligns with the immutable law of God and insofar as the law is used lawfully. The book of James says the law is good so long as it's being used lawfully. You want to use laws to ensure that more people are still murdered. I want to use laws to promote
Criminalize blasphemy.
Yeah, what?
To criminalize blasphemy.
Oh, absolutely, of course. Yes, I want to use
Who
laws
decides? Who
to
decides?
stop wickedness.
Who decides what's
and
blasphemous?
promote good. What?
Who decides what's blasphemy?
Guy with the gun.
The Lord Jesus Christ, the triune
He's not
God.
around to tell us.
Secondly, you can look to our heritage. You can look to our history. You can look to what the nation
Well, our
was in
heritage
its
says,
founding.
First Amendment, the very first line, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment
Correct.
of religion.
Congress. Let's get there. So First Amendment, let's make it even simpler. First word of the First Amendment. You're right. Congress cannot make a national church. So you cannot have a federal church over the whole country that is Episcopalian or Catholic or Baptist or whatever. But at the time that happened, you still had within the original colonies, 10 or 11 out of the 13 colonies had sanctioned churches. So technically, even with the First Amendment as it is on the books today, you could have state churches. Texas could be, Baptist, and Mississippi could be Presbyterian. You could have state churches. I'm not even saying that you should, but you could have state churches. What I would argue for at the national level is a pan-Protestant Christian nationalism. I think we should adopt a preamble.
That's a religion, isn't it?
What?
Isn't that a religion?
That's religion. Congress can't determine a religion. Congress cannot say at the national level,
the 14th Amendment it incorporates the First Amendment to apply to the states, I'll say, and the Second Amendment also didn't used to apply to the state governments. Are you suggesting under your framework you would not want the Second
my
Amendment?
theocratic framework.
So under your theocrat, you called it a theocracy.
Yes,
under your theocracy,
of course. Theocracy is wonderful.
Okay, got it. So this is what I mean.
God
So-
above the state. So separation of church and state is not the same as separation of Christ and state. There will be a God above the state. If there's no God above the state, then the state becomes God. So yes, I want Christ and state not severed. Church and state, that's different.
So we
as
can have some
institutions.
corrupt priests telling us what we're allowed to say and not.
Nope, that's an
Versus a cult, too.
ecclesiocracy.
No,
That's a church-run state.
Corrupt,
I'm saying
whatever you want to call it.
theocracy.
Whatever your corrupt ministers, your corrupt people.
No, but what you're saying is not what I'm saying.
Okay,
You're
that's what's
talking
going to
about-
happen.
you're
Though.
ta-
That's
no,
what's going to happen.
No, you're talking about
Yeah, it will.
priest
It will
running
happen.
the
It
state.
will happen.
That's a church-run state.
But hold
I'm
on.
saying a theocracy, not
Wait,
ecclesiocracy.
So this is it will happen. I agree with Pisco, but it'll happen in any system among any group of people for any reason.
Okay, so that brings up a lot of interesting points, if you ask me. Like, this country was always meant to be a Christian nation. The reason they installed the separation of church and state in our Constitution was simply because of the power of the Vatican, basically, and how they ran everything in Europe, and they were just as powerful as governments were at that point in time, as the monarchies. They were just as powerful as all these things. And, Catholicism was so dominant in Europe, they wanted people to be free to practice whatever religion that they wanted to. They wanted to be free to do that. It was just simply for the national government was not going to get involved in religion whatsoever. This was just basically to keep the states unionized, basically together, right? If you wanted a certain state to be a Catholic state, we could have that. If this one wanted to be Baptist, once again, we could have that. That's how this nation was always supposed to be, but it was always meant to be a Christian nation. It's always meant to be that way. And we have gotten away from that, folks. I think we need to get back to that because this country was much better off as far as crime, as far as economic wealth, as far as all these other metrics that we can look to when we were more of a Christian nation, when people went to church, when people believed in God, they were fearful of God. People were less prone to committing crimes and doing all these other things and, engaging in degeneracy and all this other nonsense. I think we've gotten away from that, and it's not a good look for this country, to be honest with you. We've interpreted the First Amendment has gone way too far in a lot of instances. The Second Amendment, the same thing. What they were talking about the Second Amendment, like going back to that. I don't particularly care for how they take Supreme Court precedent as amending the Constitution. Like, there's supposed to be checks and balances on all these things, and it's not that way for the Supreme Court. When the Supreme Court makes a ruling, that precedent acts as a law. And I don't think that should be the case. I think that, what Congress should do anytime there's Supreme Court precedent, if that is the case and that is the popular will of the people or whatever at the time, then Congress should codify that precedent before it becomes precedent. In other words, they should not rely on previous precedent to make rulings. In other words, Congress should codify whatever that is, right? If we don't want paranoid schizophrenics to own guns, then we should codify that into the Constitution. But Tim is right. He takes it a little bit too far, but he's right about that. Pisco is kind of right too. When, a lot of people, they will invoke their own personal grievances. Once again, whenever they feel it's politically advantageous, we'll use the Constitution to bludgeon you over the head, even though somebody wants to do something that we all know is correct. We all know it's right. But, it is what it is. And I do love how, liberals, they always argue, it says well regulated in the Second Amendment. Well, that doesn't mean much. Once again, we always have to take historical context into account when we're trying to suss out the details of what the Constitution actually means and how we're going to make our justifications for whatever we're invoking the Constitution for in today's context, right? So we always need to look back to historical context to figure these things out. If regulation meant something different back then, if it just meant, a functioning weapon, keep and bear. What does that mean? That means to own and use. To use your gun, to defend yourself. That's what that was supposed to mean, right? It doesn't really mean that we can have nuclear weapons. Right, some people make that argument, Tim Pool being chief among those. He'll make that argument. But, to be honest with you, private corporations do keep nuclear weapons, as a matter of fact. Like, who do you think the U.S. government contracts to build nuclear weapons? Private corporations build these, right? Private companies build warships. They don't necessarily keep them and bear them, but they do give them to the government, so the government can bear them. But it's fascinating to kind of dip off into the Second Amendment and try to think about these things. I think, the Second Amendment was always intent on, people keeping guns, personal firearms to defend themselves. We can look to that and think that's what that meant, but without the historical context, we'll never know. Because back then, you didn't have nuclear weapons. You didn't have jet fighters. We didn't have submachine guns and all these other things that, like a 50 cal mounted to a truck type of thing. That was never really meant to go into it, but things evolve, so we need to evolve with them. And we must amend the Constitution whenever new technology comes into place. Amend the Constitution to suit the technology that we have built for ourselves, right? I don't think it's a good idea for people to go and have Jeep with a 50 cal strapped to the top of it, right? Like, what are you going to use that for? How are you going to defend yourself with that, right? Maybe you might need to, right? Because like Joe Biden said, well, you're not going to go up against the U.S. Army with a handgun, right? You need a F-15 fighter jet. Well, then maybe we should be allowed to keep F-15 fighter jets if we can afford them. Right? There are private corporations out there that do have jet fighters that the government actually contracts these corporations to use them as opposition for training. That's interesting. Of course, they're de-toothed, if you will. You know, they take all the weapons out of them, and any secret avionics technology or anything like that they'll remove and use the jet just as that, as a training tool for training, you know, fighter jet pilots or whatever, which is fascinating if you ask me. There's all kind of interesting aspects that we can dip off into on this, but, you know, that's getting off way into the weeds. But, you know, getting back to this country should be a Christian nation. That's just my personal belief that, you know, I think we are much better off when we are ran by Christians, because that's where our morality comes from. And a lot of decisions, especially in politics, you know, we derive those decisions from our own morality. And if we don't have moral guidelines, where do those decisions go? Well, you get a lot of decisions like, you know, this transgender nonsense, these laws being made that, hey, let's go ahead and trans your kids and all this other nonsense, which is just abhorrent in my opinion. I don't think kids should be subjected to this kind of nonsense, right? Like Drag Queen Story Hour. I don't think kids should be subjected to that kind of nonsense, right? These types of things, anything of a sexual nature, should be kept private, in my opinion. I think society would be much better off if this stuff was kept private. Like Pride Month, for crying out loud. That should be a private thing. We should not have parades of celebrating your queerness, right? I don't think that's a good thing. I don't think that's good for society at all, right? Once again, heterosexual relationships. People shouldn't be making out in public. We shouldn't be putting these things in other people's face. It has nothing to do with anybody. It should be a private thing. Now, if a couple wants to hold hands walking down the street, I don't see a problem with that. If you're a gay couple, I don't see a problem with those things, right? Because that's not overly sexual. That's just the bare minimum. People hold hands all the time. You know, there's nothing to that. You know, if a kid asks why they're doing that, well, they just want to. There you go. People love each other. That's it. But, you know, now we're getting way off into the weeds on some other nonsense, but I think that's all I got on this one. I want y'all to let me know what y'all think about all this down in the comment section. It's a fascinating debate, y'all, but that's all I got. So y'all don't forget to smash that like button for me. Subscribe if you're new around here. Share this video anywhere and everywhere you can. Click that join button. Sign up and become a member. You know you want to. But outside of all that, y'all try to have a good day. And remember, folks, that God has a plan for all of us. You may not understand that plan. You may not know what it is, but it's there. You just got to suss it out for yourself. And He loves each and every one of us. We must remember that, folks. We must remember that. But like I said, y'all try to have a good day. Stay legitical. Peace.